Do you think that Jesus celebrated this festival and identified with what was called the dedication?
Well, dedication. What does it mean for people? The word Hanukkah means dedication. Hanukkah Tamiz Beach means, or Hanukkah Tabayit, it's the dedication of the temple or the dedication of the temple altar, which is a dedication that is renewed or restored, something like that. And actually, in the Gospels, I don't remember where, I think in John chapter 10, something like that, the Feast of Dedication is mentioned. And Jesus in that historical context. So I think it's difficult to determine this, and I'm going to explain why. In fact, it's interesting that on your page, Osvaldo, you have one of the finest academic videos I know of on social media. And it's a meeting between Dr. Adolfo Reitman and Dr. Antonio Pinheiro, two giants of this generation, and you managed to bring them together in a single forum. Truly, it's a milestone in academic outreach on social media. And they talked about the issue. Is it possible that Jesus and John the Baptist were Essenes? Who were the Essenes, for those listening? The Essenes were one of the many, let's say, schools that existed in Judaism at that time. There were Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, just some of the schools that existed among many others. By the way, one of the ones that is often ignored was the Juri. The ones I'm talking about are mostly from Judea, but there was Galilean Judaism, as I have mentioned, and many scholars skip over it. Very old school scholars, like, sorry to say it, yes, these scholars I just mentioned are very old school and often ignore what Galilean Judaism was. Jesus came from that context. Even so, there is this perspective that apparently Jesus, in a certain way, was influenced by the worldview of the Essenes. And it's not accurate to say that Jesus was an Essene. I think that Jesus had his own group, his own ideology, his own sect. Let's call it that, not in the derogatory sense of the word, but it was a sect, it was a group, yes, like another school. But when you analyze what's said about Jesus, at least in the Gospels, even in some apocryphal texts, you can notice many points of contact between what Jesus was and his preaching and everything that's quoted about him versus what the Essenes were. There are many things in common. I highly recommend the Daddy video for discussions on this topic. But what we generally know about the Essenes is that practically or basically the Qumranites were one of the branches that split off from the Essenes. The Qumranites were a sect that lived in the Judean desert, and they were strongly opposed to the priests of Jerusalem, because they said that the Jerusalem priests were not from the priesthood of Bet Zadok, from the house of Zadok. There was a dispute over who held the priesthood. Who were the priests at that time? In the time of the Qumranites, who were the priests of the temple? The descendants of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. The Maccabean revolt of Hanukkah was led by the priests. By Matityahu Mattathias, he was a priest. And his whole family, Yehuda Maccabi, all of them, they, Shimon Maccabi, all of them, the Maccabees were priests. And that's why their lineage is known. Their lineage, let's say, at a monarchical level. The monarchy that came from them after having freed the king of Judea from the hands of the Seleucids, they established a Jewish kingdom that is known today as the Hasmonean kingdom. The Hasmoneans were priests, and this did cause a lot of, let's say, discontent among many people, because many of the sources, Jewish ones like Amos 9:11, Isaiah 11 verse 10, 12, around there, they say that the restoration of the kingdom of Israel must be through the family, through the Davidic lineage. And that's why when they see that there is a lineage taking political power in Judea that is not a Davidic lineage, but an Aaronic one, because the priests come from Aaron. So there was indeed a great deal of discontent. Adding to that, I mean discontent that they are the ones who rule and not the descendants. On one hand, there's discontent among the Qumranites, since those serving in the temple were not from the house of Zadok. So we Qumranites chose to go into the desert, living in caves, as did many Essenes. So, if Jesus was influenced by a radical Essene perspective, it's possible that he also had a strongly critical view of the temple. And indeed, that was the case. Jesus. Very strong criticisms of the temple. We see this throughout all the Gospels, even to the point where the Johannine community who wrote the Gospel of John suggests that the temple is the body of Jesus. I mean, it gets to the point, I don't want to say it's contempt for the temple, but to the point of replacing the temple with Jesus. The entire epistle to the Hebrews is based on that, on rivaling the temple service. Jesus often criticized, such as in Matthew 24, where he says, "Do you see all these buildings? Not one stone will be left on another," and so on. So we see that apparently there really is a lot of this tone of criticism toward what was the priesthood of the Jerusalem temple because of the Essene criticism. That's why if Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, what would he be celebrating? Celebrating that the Hasmoneans have independence, that the Hasmoneans are the kings of Israel. For an Essene, this wasn't something to celebrate, since Essenes felt offended by the Hasmoneans. Why would an Essene celebrate Hanukkah? That's why I think it's true. I say that as I quoted before, John 10. I don't really remember where it is, but it talks about Jesus being in the setting of the Feast of Dedication. But if he really was strongly influenced by the Essene criticism of the temple, I don't think Jesus actually celebrated Hanukkah or that he was very happy about this event. There are many reasons to think that Jesus really had a very harsh critique of it. It was the priesthood. And that's why the whole narrative of restoring the kingdom and all these things. So that's why I think it's not easy to say that Jesus would have celebrated Hanukkah like many Jews. Yes, most Jews were glad to finally have national independence in their time.
So I gather that the short answer is that you also don't think Jesus was any kind of Pharisee from that time.
No. I think that, as I mentioned to you, when you ignore the range of Judaisms, including Galilean Judaism, which is where Jesus came from, plus the Essenes, you see that Jesus's ideological mix was something else. And it's true that sometimes you find in the Gospels some paraphrases or certain points in common with what were, let's say, statements. How do you say that? Como
Sí,
afirmaciones.
establecido.
Yes, statements that you find in Pharisaic circles. It's true that there are similar things. There are things that, which is natural, if there are exchanges, if there are interactions between the communities, because just to clarify for the audience, what are the Gospels? When we hear that Jesus said something or that someone spoke to Jesus, the Gospels are basically the product of the Christian communities that decided to write them. There was a community, let's call it the Johannine community, that had a more divinized perspective of Jesus, who saw Jesus as the Lamb of God. They decided to put their own theological perspective on paper with what they had from the tradition of what had happened with Jesus. That's how they wrote what we now call the Gospel of John, since that's the name chosen later. There is another group known as the Markan community. I don't know what to call it in Spanish, but this community, it had a different tradition. They didn't see Jesus as quite so divine. In fact, they saw him as much more human, more trying to perform miracles and all these things. And they wrote a gospel called the Gospel of Mark, which is what it was called later. And so all the traditions did things differently, or all the Christian communities, wherever they settled, they made, let's say, stories about Jesus and put words in Jesus' mouth. According to how they saw Jesus approach, according to their community tradition, let's say, or their particularistic leadership approach. That's why you see contradictions in the Gospels. That's why when they say, no, it's because Jesus said such a thing. That's not the real Jesus. That's the Jesus of the evangelists or the editors, because, for example, it's said that Matthew had 5 editors. That's the construct that the evangelists put in Jesus' mouth. And it's natural that if you see communities that among them there was movement of Jews in and out and dialogues with both Jews and non-Jews. Even in the Talmud's Tractat Shabbat, there are discussions and gospel quotations involving both groups. And these types of interactions existed. So it's not surprising that there is something, a topic, for example, the topic of whether you can heal a person on Shabbat or not. That was the trending topic everyone discussed, including the Pharisees and others. So it's not surprising to see statements and debates about Shabbat and healing on Shabbat. That's why I think it's not correct to call Jesus a Pharisee, because it's much more complex than that. Jesus' analytical methods were not Pharisaic. Sometimes we see similar glimpses, but at least, again, it's not the Jesus of the Gospels where the evangelists put words in his mouth. That wasn't the real Jesus. Let's be honest, the real Jesus could have said other things. He could have had a different worldview. And what we have are the canonical Gospels, because the apocryphal ones were set aside. The canonized ones are the lens or the standard to measure what Jesus said, but maybe the story was different, so I don't think it's very accurate to claim such a thing about Jesus as a Pharisee.